I realized something was wrong, not because he shouted, not because he struck anyone, and not because he hesitated. I realized it because he spoke too precisely and yet made a mistake no one from his world ever made. The frost was sharp that morning, biting through our coats as we stood aligned on the parade ground, our breaths hanging low and white, indistinguishable from one another. When he turned slightly toward the visiting officer and addressed him calmly, almost politely, as Comrade Lieutenant, the words settled into the silence like ash. The man he spoke to was a captain. Everyone knew it. Even we knew it, and we were the ones expected not to know anything at all. No one corrected him. No one reacted. The captain did not flinch, did not raise his voice, did not show confusion or anger. He simply stared at the man who had just demoted him with a single word, stared long enough for the cold to creep further into our bones. And in that stretched moment, I felt a quiet certainty bloom inside me, slow and terrible. Prisoners make that mistake. Prisoners confuse ranks, because ranks mean nothing once you are stripped of your name. Officers do not. Officers of the security services are trained to recognize hierarchy as instinctively as breathing. They may forget faces, may forget mercy, but they never forget who outranks whom. The man who stood before us wearing the uniform of authority recovered quickly. He corrected himself without apology, adjusted his tone, and continued issuing orders as if nothing had happened. The captain accepted the correction as if it were natural, even expected. The moment passed, absorbed by routine, swallowed by fear. But it did not pass inside me. It lodged itself somewhere deep, beside other small irregularities I had noticed and dismissed, and began to grow. Until that morning, I had believed him to be exactly what he appeared to be. He arrived at the camp with clean papers, immaculate stamps, and an efficiency that felt almost surgical. The previous commandant had been crude, unpredictable, prone to drunken rages and pointless cruelty. This new one was different. He spoke softly. He quoted regulations instead of inventing punishments. He observed rather than erupted. That difference alone made him terrifying, because restraint in such a place felt unnatural, like calm water above a minefield. He knew the system well. He knew which reports mattered and which disappeared into archives no one read. He understood how to balance quotas, how to meet expectations without attracting unnecessary attention. He punished when required, but not excessively. He rewarded compliance with small mercies that were never acknowledged as such. He was efficient in a way that made the camp run smoother, and that smoothness itself was disturbing. Men stopped dying in chaotic ways and began dying on schedule. Yet even in those early weeks, there were moments when his mask slipped. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone to accuse him, but enough to unsettle. He would pause too long at certain corners of the camp, places not marked on any official map. He referred to locations using names that did not exist in documentation, names whispered among prisoners long before he arrived. Once, during a night inspection, he flinched at the sound of the whistle that signaled morning assembly, though it was hours away and blown accidentally by a careless guard. It was not the flinch of authority startled by error. It was the reflex of someone conditioned by fear. After the incident with the rank, I began watching him closely. Watching in the way prisoners learn to watch, silently, indirectly, always appearing obedient. I noticed that when he reviewed files, he handled them with reverence, almost tenderness, as if the paper itself mattered more than the lives described within. But when he stood among people, his gaze drifted, unfocused, as though faces were temporary and interchangeable. He never asked why anyone was there, not once. Other officers sometimes indulged their curiosity, sometimes mocked us with questions about our crimes, real or imagined. He never did. He issued orders based solely on what was written, never probing beyond it. That absence of curiosity struck me as strange. It suggested not indifference, but familiarity, as if he already knew the answer and knew it did not matter. One night, long after lights out, I was summoned to the administrative building. Such summonses rarely ended well. I walked through the snow expecting pain, or worse, but when I entered his office, he was alone, sitting without his jacket, sleeves rolled up. The lamp on his desk cast harsh shadows, and for the first time I saw his hands clearly. Around his wrists were faint, pale scars, uneven and old. Rope burns, not the kind inflicted during service, the kind inflicted on those who are tied and dragged and left hanging. He noticed my gaze and did not attempt to hide them. He simply folded his hands together. He told me, without preamble, that his name was not the name on his papers. He told me that according to official records, he had been executed years ago, during one of the quieter waves, when paperwork mattered more than spectacle. He told me that his survival was not an act of heroism or resistance, but of utility. Someone had needed a man who knew the camp from the inside. Someone had realized that fear functions best when it wears a familiar face. He did not ask me to help him escape. He did not ask for loyalty. He ordered me to forget what I had seen and heard. Then he dismissed me. From that moment, the camp changed again, subtly but decisively. Punishments became more precise. Transfers increased. Lists were revised. I began to understand that he was not soft, nor secretly benevolent. He was efficient in a different way. He understood exactly how much pressure a man could endure before breaking, because he had measured that limit in himself. He knew when to stop, not out of mercy, but out of calculation. I realized then that his mistake with the rank had not been a slip of ignorance, but of identity. In that brief moment, standing among officers, he had forgotten which side he was supposed to be on. The second act of the story unfolded with the arrival of inspectors from the center. Such visits were rare and dreaded. They meant scrutiny, comparison, evaluation. They meant that even officers were suddenly vulnerable. Our commandant prepared meticulously. Files were aligned, numbers reconciled, stories rehearsed. He moved through the camp with an intensity that bordered on desperation, correcting minor errors, instructing guards with unusual urgency. On the morning of the inspection, I saw him hesitate before putting on his cap, just for a second, long enough for me to wonder whether he was remembering another cap, another uniform, another role. The inspectors were thorough. They questioned procedures, examined logs, cross-checked names, and then, inevitably, they reached his file. The past, which had been buried under layers of authority, began to stir. A discrepancy here, a date that did not align, a signature that resembled another long archived. The mistake with the rank resurfaced, referenced casually, almost jokingly, by the captain who had not forgotten. Laughter followed, forced laughter, then silence. He was taken away quietly, no struggle, no protest. The announcement came the next day that he had died in the line of duty, that his service was exemplary, that the camp would continue as before. A new commandant arrived within the week, one who never misnamed ranks and never flinched at whistles. But the ending did not bring relief. It brought something worse. Because in the absence of the man who had once been a prisoner, the camp lost its strange balance. The new commandant followed rules flawlessly, without hesitation or memory. Death became careless again. Punishments lost precision and gained enthusiasm. Men died faster, louder, more pointlessly. And I understood then, with a bitterness that burned hotter than fear, that the man who was not truly an officer had been the most accurate expression of the system. He was its perfect product. Not an outsider infiltrating power, but a victim molded into an instrument so refined that it no longer needed belief, only function. The mistake he made was not calling a captain by the wrong rank. The mistake was surviving long enough to forget who he had been. And the system corrected that error, as it always does, efficiently and without remorse. The story did not end with his removal, because nothing ever truly ends in a place designed only for continuation. The camp absorbed his absence the way it absorbed everything else, quietly, without ceremony, adjusting its rhythms until suffering once again became uneven and loud. I expected the memory of him to fade, to be buried under new routines and new faces, but instead it sharpened. Every time the new commandant barked an order or struck a man for no reason beyond mood, I remembered the precision of the one who had come before and felt a confused, shameful sense of loss. The new officers arrived eager, clean in a way that only ignorance allows. They believed in the structure, in the righteousness of hierarchy, in the fiction that cruelty was justice when properly documented. They laughed loudly in the evenings, drank openly, and spoke about promotions. They never hesitated, never questioned, never flinched. Watching them, I understood that the previous commandant had not been an anomaly, but a warning. He had shown what happened when the system devoured one of its own, and then put the remains back to work. Weeks passed. Winter deepened. The camp returned to its older habits. Deaths increased. Mistakes were made and punished arbitrarily. I was transferred to a work detail near the outer perimeter, close enough to the forest to smell freedom without ever touching it. From there, I sometimes saw fresh prisoners arriving, their faces still full of questions, and I wondered how long it would take before those questions were erased. One evening, as we returned from labor, an older prisoner beside me whispered a name. It was the commandant's real name, the one he had confessed to me in that lamplit office. I stopped walking. The guard shouted. I stumbled forward. The whisper lingered. I realized then that I was not the only one he had spoken to, not the only one who had seen the scars, not the only one who understood. He had not built loyalty. He had spread a quiet infection of knowledge. That knowledge changed nothing immediately. It could not. We were still trapped, still numbered, still disposable. But it altered how we saw the uniforms. When an officer passed, I no longer saw authority alone. I saw a potential future prisoner, a body that might one day be repurposed. The boundary between ruler and captive blurred, not in practice, but in possibility. Months later, rumors reached us of purges within the administration, of officers arrested overnight, of files reopened. I thought of him then, of how easily he had stepped from one column to another, from condemned to commander. I imagined his final moments not as heroic or defiant, but as exhausted, perhaps even relieved. To be erased properly, without contradiction, might have felt like rest. The last time I thought of him was years later, long after I had stopped believing in release, and long before it unexpectedly came. I was older, thinner, quieter. When my name was finally called and I was told I could leave, the word felt unreal, like a foreign language. As I walked past the gates, past the guards who did not look at me, I noticed one young officer correcting another on a minor procedural detail, his voice sharp with pride. For a moment, I almost laughed. Outside the camp, the world had changed and had not changed at all. People hurried, argued, loved, and betrayed one another under the same sky. The system remained, vast and faceless. Somewhere, I was certain, another man was being broken carefully, taught how to survive by becoming useful, prepared to wear a uniform that did not belong to him. And I knew, with a clarity that filled me with cold anger rather than hope, that if I ever heard an officer hesitate over a rank again, even for a heartbeat, I would recognize it not as a flaw, but as proof that the machine was still feeding on itself, and that no one, on either side of the wire, was ever truly free. Freedom did not soften that understanding. it sharpened it. Outside the wire, I learned how quietly the world cooperates with violence when it is properly named. People spoke of order, of necessity, of difficult times that required firm hands. They spoke the same way the officers had spoken, with the same careful detachment, and I felt the camp follow me like a shadow that stretched across streets and kitchens and trains. At night I dreamed of ranks, not faces, not blows, not snow, but ranks. Insignia melting and reforming, stars falling from collars and reappearing on different shoulders. In the dreams, no one ever noticed when a rank was wrong. No one except me. I would try to speak, to correct it, but my mouth would fill with paper, with forms and stamped approvals, until I could not breathe. Years later, I met a man in a crowded station who wore a coat cut too precisely for his thin body. He stood with the same stillness I remembered, the stillness of someone waiting to be noticed or erased. When an official approached him and asked for documents, the man answered calmly, politely, and for a brief moment I felt the old tightening in my chest. Then it happened. He addressed the official as Comrade Major. The official was a colonel. Nothing came of it. The official corrected him absently, barely listening, already thinking of something else. The man nodded and stepped aside. The world moved on. I stood frozen, trembling, not with fear but with recognition. I understood then that the mistake was no longer rare. It was spreading. Not because people were careless, but because the distance between power and punishment had thinned. Too many had crossed it in one direction and survived. Too many had learned that identity could be reassigned, that guilt and authority were interchangeable labels applied by whoever held the pen. The camp had not been an exception. It had been a rehearsal. I never reported the man. I never spoke to him. I walked away and carried the knowledge with me, heavy and useless. Rage flared and cooled, over and over, because there was no single target for it. You cannot confront a shape that keeps changing uniforms. Sometimes I imagine the first commandant again, the one who had once been tied and renamed and repurposed. I imagine him standing in some final corridor, hearing his sentence read aloud, listening for mistakes that would tell him who was still human in the room. I imagine his disappointment when there were none. The cruelest truth, the one that still wakes me before dawn, is not that the system destroys people. It is that it studies them carefully first. It learns exactly how much they can endure, exactly what they can become, and then it uses that knowledge to perfect itself. He was not exposed because he had been a prisoner. He was exposed because he hesitated, because for a fraction of a second he remembered a world where ranks were shouted at him instead of worn. That memory betrayed him. And I know, with a certainty that leaves no room for comfort, that when all hesitation is finally trained out of everyone, when no one ever misnames a rank again, that will not mean justice has arrived. It will mean the machine has finished learning.